Hi, everybody. I think it's 12 o'clock, so we can get started. Thanks for joining me today at Photos at Zoom, a presentation of the Museum of Contemporary Photography at Columbia College, Chicago. I'm Karen Irvine. I'm the Chief Curator and Deputy Director of the museum. And Photos at Zoom is a virtual extension of a program that we normally do in the museum, where people come into our print study room and we pull out objects and we facilitate discussion and questions about them. So of course, in this virtual format, it will be largely one directional. I'm going to share with you a lot of images from our collection that all have to do with Chicago and tell you a few things about them. And then at the end, I'll answer any questions that have been put into the Q&A box during the course of the presentation. So please feel free to comment or ask any questions that you'd like to. But without further ado, I will get started. One second, sorry, I'm having technical difficulty. Bear with me for 1 minute. My PowerPoint is not advancing. There we go. Can everybody see this? I'm sharing my screen, everybody can see it. Hang on. Okay. So as I was preparing the presentation, I came across something that I didn't know we had, which was 3 albumin prints by the duo of Lovejoy and Foster that were taken just after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. The duo became really well known actually for documenting the city after the destruction, and they actually put together a book of all the photographs called Rebuilt Chicago 1872. This image shows the water tower and the water pumping station in Chicago, which were 2 of the buildings that survived the Great Chicago Fire. And I found online one image that they made of the aftermath, immediate aftermath of the fire. This is the only object I'm going to show you today that's not in our collection, but it's the corner of Wabash and Monroe, which is in the heart of downtown Chicago, and it shows you the extent of the destruction. But apparently the city was rebuilt very quickly. So already by 1872, we see a location that's very close to the previous location that's already got a lot of buildings standing. And here's another view of the south side of Chicago. Albumin prints were the most widespread form of photographs from about 1855 to 1895. And it's a very special process. It's paper that's coated with egg white. And within the egg white, there's suspended light-sensitive silver nitrate particles that capture the image. So albumin printing allowed photography to become very widespread, and most photographic collections that have 19th century collections, the most of the objects are albumin prints. But I thought these were really an interesting look back at the city's skyline. But now I'm going to jump to mid-century and talk a little bit about Harry Callahan, who's one of the most iconic photographers from Chicago, very known for making kind of lyrical and experimental and kind of unusual photographs of very conventional things, like buildings, for example. He was fascinated with design, and his photographs always kind of flirted with abstraction. So they kind of approach abstraction, if you will. Callahan was the head of the photography department at the Institute of Design, better known as the ID. And if you don't know that history in Chicago, that was a really important institution. The Bauhaus that was founded in Germany in 1919 was coming to a close because of the onset of the war in 1937. And Laszlo Moholy-Nagy moved to Chicago and kind of brought the Bauhaus with him and started what was called then the New Bauhaus. A year later, Mies van der Rohe joined him. Mies had been the head of the Bauhaus in Germany, and Mies started the architecture department at IIT, where the ID was. So between the two of them, the ID became, and that university became really kind of an epicenter of modernism. And Callahan kind of extended some of the traditions of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and the Bauhaus in that he required his students to really practice with materials and get to know the properties, the special properties of the materials. So in the case of photography, it would be printing papers and light, to be highly experimental, and then to go out into the world and try to kind of apply the artist's own vision to everyday and ordinary life. So Callahan, with his sort of, with one of his colleagues, Aaron Siskind, the kind of brought the photography department at the ID into its prime in the 1950s, if you will. Here's another view of Harry Callahan's buildings. And then this is the only picture I put into the presentation that's not from Chicago. Actually, it's Detroit. I figured close enough. But I loved that you see is kind of taking a very straight subject, in this case, the reeds in the water, but kind of using the camera's ability to flatten things out more than kind of the human eye can see, to really enhance the sense of design here. It almost becomes like a drawing. Another Chicago view. And then Callahan also loved to photograph his wife, Eleanor, and their daughter, and no presentation about Chicago can't include pictures of the lakefront. So you'll see many pictures of Lake Michigan in this presentation. Aaron Siskind took over the head, being chair of the department after Callahan left. And he was then head of the department for about 10 years. And Siskind started as a documentary photographer, but then by the 1940s became really more interested in abstraction, and kind of upending the notion that photography has to be representational. So he photographed graffiti around the city, and he became really important in terms of the avant-garde in art in this country. He befriended painters like Mark Rothko and Franz Klein, who of course saw an affinity in Callahan's work to their own, in that it kind of flattened the pictorial plane and then was really interested in the compositional elements. I loved this one when I found it in our collection because it kind of looks like in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a man there wearing a hat, but of course it's just paint on the wall. And then one more facade view by Siskind. And a very famous series that Siskind executed in 1961 is called The Pleasures and Terrors of Levitation. And this is simply divers on Chicago's lakefront that he captured without context. And he was interested in the fact that when they're decontextualized, you can't really tell if these are joyful moments or if they're ones of terror. And I pulled a quote from him describing the experience of kind of starting this project. So in 1978, he said, "I was walking along the lake in Chicago and I saw these guys jumping off a diving board. It was a beautiful Sunday and I was just walking along with my Rolleiflex. I sat down and started taking pictures of them without knowing exactly what I was doing, only that I was taking pictures of divers. The results didn't particularly interest me until I looked at one that struck me. This guy was a diver, but he wasn't a diver. He was levitating as if in a dream state. And then I knew what I was after." So Siskind and Callahan were very influential on generations of photographers even to this day. And some of the next couple of photographers I'll discuss were their students. So Richard Nicol studied with both of them in the 1950s. And he was really interested in architecture and architectural preservation specifically. So by the 1950s in Chicago, many historical buildings were being torn down. And Nicol literally went on a crusade with his camera to try to document all of the buildings as a form of preservation and a record of their architectural mastery, but also collected ornamental elements from them. So would take pieces of terracotta and stones and so forth back to him, back to his studio. He became the most fascinated with Louis Sullivan, and he, together with Siskind, tried to compile a book that would kind of document every single one of Adler and Sullivan's studios buildings. So this is one example, the Auditorium building in Chicago. And he was instrumental also in documenting and moving the trading one of the rooms from the Chicago Stock Exchange to the Art Institute of Chicago before it was destroyed. And he actually lost his life in 1972. He went back to the building and was collecting more ornamental elements when the trading floor collapsed and crushed him. So very sad story. He died pursuing his passion. Yasuhiro Ishimoto is a very well-known Chicago photographer and also a student of Callahan and Siskind at the ID. And he became known as somebody who really blended kind of the styles of American photography with more of a Japanese aesthetic. And he had a really interesting history. He was born in the United States, but then spent a large portion of his childhood in Japan, and then came back to Northwestern University to study architecture, which really influenced his photography throughout his career. But then was actually in a Japanese internment camp from in the late 40s, early 50s, and ended up back in Chicago for a 3-year stint from 1958 to 1961 on a Minolta Fellowship, where he just really documented the city and then it was formulated into a book called Chicago, Chicago. And you can see some of his street scenes here. And it really just kind of captures the details of the time and the place. I love the advertising, the huge advertising here. And Chicago's famous elevated train tracks. And now we're on to Barbara Crane. Barbara was also a student at the ID. She got her master's degree there in 1966. And you can see some of the influence of the ID in a series that she made about the Chicago Loop, which was from 1969 to 1978, she worked on this. And similar to Callahan and Siskind, she's really exploiting the camera's tendency to flatten our sense of space sometimes with the right composition, particularly if you take the horizon line out, and really focusing on graphic elements, shapes, lines, and forms, and kind of unsettling our perception to the point where we're not exactly sure which plane maybe is, further closer to us than or further behind. Barbara was an early investigator of repetition, and she loved to explore the deconstruction of information. So she did a series called Repeats, where she would take pictures and then go into the darkroom and take the negatives and print them in such a way that they were kind of flipped. Here you see the Dan Ryan Expressway flipped kind of upside down and right side up, and then put a lot of attention to how the images were like ordered right and left to create these compositions that really from a distance do look like abstractions, but then when they require close scrutiny. When you get close up, you can kind of deconstruct all of the elements. She was interested in the narratives that might come out of these sorts of arrangements. And I have a really nice quote from her from one of her artist statements. She said, "The issues in my work are often of a similar nature with an abstract edge. Though I build on past experience, I attempt to eradicate previous habits of seeing and thinking. I keep searching for what is visually new to me, while always hoping that a fusion of form and content will take place." This one is really hard to see, but it's pictures of birds and little splotches of tar. But I read a really nice story about Barbara. She loved to work with birds at a certain point, and at one time she went into Grant Park and she laid on her back with her camera, and she had her assistant spread bird food, just like bread or birdseed, all around her to attract the birds. And then once they were all there, she had the assistant run up to the birds, scare them away, and then she started taking pictures on her back to capture the birds against the sky. So again, highly experimental work. And yeah, and another great project that she did is called People of the North Portal from 1970, where she simply stood outside of the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago and captured like people coming out, exiting through the doors, and entering the museum. Some of them are kind of from this vantage point where you get the full body, including the fashion of the time and different family configurations and expressions, but and some of them are more close up where she really kind of hones in just on the person's face. It's a really wonderful kind of snapshot of Chicago in 1970. Michael Abramson is somebody who also got a master's degree from the ID, but this time in the 70s. And he had a lot of attention for a project that he started there, which was called Black Nightclubs of Chicago's South Side. He just went and documented the joy and dancing and people in these clubs. And it was a really successful project. Again, we see kind of this, the 70s fashion coming through and so forth. He did also strip clubs and blues clubs, but he really was mostly known for this Chicago nightclub work. Kerry Coppin is an artist in our collection who is interested in Black communities throughout the world. So he took pictures not only in the United States, but also in Africa and the Caribbean. And he was really interested in kind of everyday life in environments. And he wanted to kind of counter what he saw as being more typical images that we see of African communities throughout the diaspora and in Africa specifically, in that we also see, and we often see images of drought and war and famine, and at this time the AIDS crisis. And he really wanted to counter that in our culture by providing images of just more joyful scenes in everyday life. And he was one of the photographers that was in a really important project that the museum was heavily involved with called Changing Chicago. And Changing Chicago took place in 1987, and it was funded by one of the museum's former board members, Jack Jaffe, and his Focus Infinity Fund, where he gathered a group of 33 photographers to go out into Chicago with the intention of documenting every kind of form of life. They could do whatever project they wanted to do, and then bring the results back, and they were shown at 5 different museums across Chicago. And so I'm going to show you a lot of those pictures. And Kerry extended his work looking at Black communities for the Changing Chicago project by visiting, for example, this opening where he recorded this musician and different celebrations and so forth. The Changing Chicago project, 1987 was a significant date because it was the 150th anniversary of the invention of photography, and it was the 50th anniversary of the start of the FSA documentary project. So, and at the time, it was actually the largest kind of city-based documentary project. Patty Carroll, who is a Chicago photographer, participated in it. Patty's been known throughout her career for investigating American pop culture and kind of all of its vibrant color and commercialism. And for Changing Chicago, she looked at hot dog stands throughout the city. At that time, there were 2,000 hot dog stands, and she was really fascinated by, most of them were independently run, so the signage was, just had a lot of individualism to it, and she was really interested in how the owners' identities were reflected in the stands, and they all kind of took on their own character. Susan Crocker looked at construction in Chicago. So Chicago is such a city that's renowned for architecture, but Crocker wanted to look at the steel workers. And so in her images, we sometimes see like peaks of the iconic architecture, like in this case, it's Bertrand Goldberg's Marina City. But she was really interested in the men primarily who kind of constructed the buildings. Behind this gentleman, you see the Hancock building. And the kind of the putting a face to the unsung kind of important people that make these buildings happen. Stephen Mark is another Changing Chicago photographer. And like Kerry Coppin, he was also interested in documenting everyday life in Black communities. So with a lot of warmth and joy, he documented things like card games, street scenes, youth, and there's got a sense of humor. And he's actually continued then to document kind of places where you can sense African heritage throughout the world. Melissa Ann Pinney participated in Changing Chicago as well. And in her work, she's known for kind of documenting the everyday lives of girls and women. And in Changing Chicago, she focused on crowded social situations that serve as rites of passage, like weddings, middle school dances, trips to the beauty salon, and so forth. I love how the girls tower over some of the boys here. Antonio Perez, another Chicago photographer who's a really well-known photojournalist. He's had a lot of work published in the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune and major magazines. He was born in Chicago and raised in Chicago, and he wanted to explore the neighborhoods of Chicago that he grew up in. And he explained, "This area has been my home since birth and has a rich family and work ethic history. Through my photographs, I hope to show its many hidden treasures, seen in the expressions of people." I liked the notion of treasures. This is a more recent one of his pictures from an immigration rally at Federal Plaza, and that's an Alexander Calder sculpture that's very famous in Chicago. Barbara Kyrie and Lindsey Lachman looked at the suburbs of Chicago for changing Chicago in the late 80s, a time, like I mentioned, where there was a lot of more development happening as well, and where the suburbs kind of kept expanding. They have been an artist duo since 1977, and they met at the ID. They wrote about this project: "From Oakland to the Naperville corridor, up the tri-state to Deerfield and down to Orland Park, we traveled along miles of strip architecture, subdivisions, and corporate corridors. In the unintentional minimalism and enforced uniformity, we saw a newly planted culture with its fundamental interests bared." Bob Thal is a Chicago photographer who's been working, documenting the city for decades. And he also explored the cities, similar to Curry and Lachman, focusing kind of on the area just beyond O'Hare Airport, where rings of suburbs kept expanding, particularly in the 1990s. Bob has a good sense of humor, so this one is a play on the Ansel Adams photograph Moonrise over Hernandez, New Mexico from 1941. And in this case, we have Moonrise over Fox Valley Mall. But like I said, Bob's been taking pictures in Chicago forever. He uses a large format camera. They're very straightforward. We see Marina City here on the right in that picture as well. And this was an example of his contribution to changing Chicago. Art Shea has to be one of the most prolific photographers who has ever worked in Chicago. He published over 30,000 photographs, and he, also working very much in an editorial mode, documented everything from the 1968 convention that we see here to Muhammad Ali to John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign. And some of his most well-known work stemmed from a friendship that he struck up with Nelson Algren. Shea had pitched to Life magazine wanting to do a photo essay about Algren, which was never published, but he ended up finding him and spending time with him on the west side of Chicago, and they encountered addicts and alcoholics and prostitutes and bums. And this is a really kind of gritty, but psychologically kind of brewing portrait of Algren and Chicago at that time that's in many collections. Shea also has a sense of humor and loved to photograph his family. So here we can see kind of something that records trends of the time in 1960, and his wife is the woman, Florence, who is in the white t-shirt on the upper right. He's got many pictures of her as well. And then of course, some of Chicago's cultural icons, in this case, Gwendolyn Brooks, portrait by Art Shea. And now I'm going to jump into more contemporary work, more recent work that depicts various elements of Chicago. I'm going to start also with somebody who looked at the kind of artistic cultural heritage of Chicago, but both past and present. And that's Michael Schmeling, who we commissioned in 2014 to come to Chicago and look at the music scene. Michael had done a really great project about hip hop in Atlanta. And so I challenged him to come to the city and kind of, because Chicago has such a strong musical legacy, obviously, with the blues and jazz. But Michael opted to kind of look at more all types of music in Chicago and how Chicago is really an incubator for a lot of people's careers and more of the grassroots. There's so much there's so many hidden concert venues and garages and basements and in restaurants, and very important historical record labels like this one that we see at Delmark Records. And it's a place where, you know, there are a lot of rising stars. So in that time, Tink was kind of on the up and up in Homewood. So we combined portraits and scenes from clubs and parties and historical locations to kind of create this portrait of Chicago as a real kind of mix and an inspirational place that both draws on its legacy of jazz and blues, but also nurtures a lot of young artists so that they can start careers and allows them a lot of opportunities for early in their career. This is a poster that he put together, a series of posters that have both contemporary and historical images of Chicago, and then even included one of the lakefront in this one. And then David Hart, this is a really interesting work called Stray Light from 2011. David got access to the Johnson Publishing Company headquarters, which was in a building on Michigan Avenue designed by John Tausendmy in 1971. And he was the first African-American architect to build a building in downtown Chicago. And he collaborated with Arthur Elrod on the interior design because he really wanted to reflect kind of the progressive nature of John and Eunice Johnson and how they were tastemakers for really middle-class Black America for so many years through their magazines, Jet and Ebony. So David got access to the headquarters, which was really very much in 2010, which was really very much a time capsule. And he made a film that we acquired. This is a still from the film. At the moment where the company was just about to move out, they weren't really occupying a lot of the space with active personnel. So David made this beautiful film where it's like a series of long shots that almost appear like still photographs until there's a slight movement. Really, really lovely. So an important Chicago institution. If you saw one of our behind the lenses a few weeks ago, we were able to visit Vera Luder's studio, and she made this piece on commission for us in 2001. And this is a huge piece that's a direct image. It's made in a camera obscura. So she got into an office space and darkened the whole room, just leaving a tiny aperture, and then took huge pieces of photographic paper and put them on the wall opposite. And so in a camera obscura, as you may know, the light comes through the aperture and refracts and then projects on the wall across from it. So this in an upside down fashion. So this image is actually upside down, but it's a direct imprint of the image coming through the window, through the aperture in the window. And so it's really a negative. Everything is reversed. The darks are light and the lights are darks, and where there's movement, you see quite a bit of blurriness, like in the flags, for example, because it was a very long exposure. That's the Wrigley Building in Chicago and Michigan Avenue, a really well-known corner. Scott Fortino is another artist. We have a series of his lakefront pictures like this one, where they're really, again, almost like Barbara Crane or Callahan, focused on design and line and shape and kind of creating the illusion of flatness in this work. But I really wanted to show you Scott's newest work, which was started in 2014, and it's called Between Utility and Desire, where he's going to some of the most iconic buildings in Chicago. In this case, it's 880 North Lakeshore Drive by Mies van der Rohe, and shooting from the outside to the inside, but including the reflections from the outside that appear in the glass. He's kind of opening up the details, the messy details of being inhabited and being outside that kind of join up with the glass and steel austerity that is the design of the building, but yet it's much more complicated to experience these spaces in real life. Michael Wolff came to Chicago and did a commissioned project for us in 2007. He had exhibited with us in 2005, and he had been working at that time, living and working in Hong Kong, where he was exploring urban density. So he would do that by often also eliminating the horizon line and capturing kind of the tall high-rise buildings in Hong Kong where many people live. And when he came to Chicago, of course, our urban density is a lot different, but he became fascinated with some of the buildings and the level of transparency, so hence the title Transparent City. in these, that they have huge windows, and often when people live there, they don't bother to close their shades anymore because they just get used to kind of living in a fishbowl. And so with the pictures of the architecture, he actually pulled out details from those pictures, and you can see how pixelated they become when he goes that far in, of people just living in these structures and experiencing emotions and working and playing and so forth. So that was a really nice series. And then finally, Philippe Dujardin was in the Chicago Architecture Biennial in 2017. And he came to Chicago and he did this project that kind of plays on Mises' work, obviously. It's called Mies Delirium. He was a professional architectural photographer for a long time, just doing straight work. And then he decided he wanted to create his own designs. So he started to composite images that play on Chicago's kind of in this case, Chicago's architectural legacy. And if you're from Chicago, you will recognize a lot of these buildings, just they're much more elongated and stretched out. And here's a composition of some of Chicago's historical buildings. Before I take questions, I just wanted to remind everybody that we have a studio visit on Friday. It's with Akinibiyi from Berlin. He's a street photographer, born in the UK to Nigerian parents, and he's also worked all over the world. And we just acquired two big grids of his work taken in Chicago. So that will be really interesting on Friday at noon. So let me stop sharing and then I'll see if there are questions. So did the ID photographers simply remove the context, or did they preferentially use narrow angle telephoto lenses? I think they just removed the information. I don't know anything about their use of telephoto lenses, but I think it was really more a matter of kind of positioning the camera in the right way, or cropping in the darkroom would also do that. Let me see. Any other questions? I see we have 97 people here. So here comes some. Will this be available to watch? Yes, they're all posted on our website. Links to Vimeo are posted on our website, so you can watch this. Oh, let's see if there's something here. The Barber crane repeats, what is the overall size? They are very small. They're probably typically like 12 inches by 2 inches. They're very tiny, so they're not big. And we have we've done a lot of these presentations, so there are a lot on our website now, on all different topics. And we're going to continue to do virtual programming at least through the fall, if not longer. So what's nice about it is that a lot of people are able to participate from all over the world. So thanks to everybody who tuned in. Any thoughts on why the ID photo department is no longer? I don't know, actually. I don't know the history, the recent history there. If anybody knows, please type it into the chat. What upcoming shows do we have? Well, we're just opening on July 7th, a show called Temporal. It's about Puerto Rican resistance that's organized by our curatorial fellow for diversity in the arts, Delina Perdomo Alvarez. It's about 9 artists from Puerto Rico who are looking at the recent history of Puerto Rico primarily living through Hurricane Maria and the Promesa Act and kind of the turbulence that comes from shifts in government and Puerto Rico's status of being kind of a territory of the United States and in some ways almost like a colony. So it's really interesting. It's got really great work in it. After that, we have a show that's geared towards the election in November, which is called What Does Democracy Look Like? And there we have 7 professors from Columbia College who are all answering that question using objects from our collection. So they have, some are looking at voting patterns, some are looking at what are the hallmarks of democracy and how have those been witnessed through photography over time. So it's really, it'll have a lot of different images, a lot of historical work from our collection will be in that show. So that's the next two. Oh, but the photos I showed were essentially all black and white. Any particular reason? I mean, part of the reason is that many of them came from the Changing Chicago project, and most of those photographers, most of those projects were in black and white. Still in 1987, they were documentary in nature, and that was still kind of the most prevalent approach, I would say, at that time. But no, that wasn't intentional. It was really just because a lot of the work was now work that we would really deem historical, but that it came out of that large documentary project. Great. Do we have Barbara Caron's Johnson & Johnson building work in your collection? No, we don't. We don't have that. Oh yeah, what is the likelihood of getting some of the living photographers to present in the Zoom series? Kerry Coppin, Stephen Mark. Yeah, they would both be great. Those are great ideas for our Behind the Lens program on Fridays is studio visits, and kind of we can work with anybody from all over the world. So those are two really good ideas. I'd like to see them speak myself. How did we come to choose the theme for this talk? We've been doing all different themes from queer photography to color theory. There's been a whole host of them. And I think just because obviously our collection is so rich in images of Chicago, we thought there would be an interest in this. Great. May we access the collection archives if visiting? Yes, you can look at any object in our collection if you make an appointment. We have a print study room, so it just requires 2 weeks notice. And on our website under education, there's a tab for print viewings and tours. So if you contact my colleague, Kristen Taylor, through that method, she can set you up with an appointment and we could pull theoretically anything, assuming it's on site. We have some objects that are off site, but if we have it and it's not too fragile, we are happy to always share objects with any researcher or just somebody from the general public who's interested. Do you expect to see photographers to use the same style to capture the giddy or gritty Chicago from the 50s and 60s? How has that feel of Chicago been lost? How have photographers moved on? Yeah, those are difficult questions to answer. I mean, there are always photographers still out there kind of practicing and using styles and looks from past decades. So I don't know if, but times change and trends change and equipment changes. So yeah, we don't see a lot of that black and white street photographer, from a 35mm camera, printed in a gritty fashion so much anymore, like the Art Shea images of Nelson Algren, for example, that has a certain feel to it. But it's still happening. It's so much more fun to have a dialogue than answer questions into the void. But thank you so much. And I think we're gonna sign off now. Please join us on Friday. Thank you, bye.